and orchestra choirs, and their tradition, which this is the first time we were at it, was to end it with the Handel's Messiah, the Hallelujah Chorus. And they had alumni come up, and all the choirs were up there, and alumni, and almost everybody there stood, even though they weren't invited to stand, and you could see half the people singing along with that. And what's amazing is Handel did not write that for Christmas, he wrote that for Easter. So it's actually an Easter piece that has somehow become a really popular Christmas piece. What I like about that, though, is that for those people there, most of those people, that probably made their day. That little event probably changed the day in a cool way for all of those there. Sort of an inbreaking, a way of God whispering, blessing them in an unexpected way. I would have loved to have been there when that happened. Especially knowing that it was an opera company doing it, so you top-notch voices. But that inbreaking is kind of one of the things that's about this passage in Matthew's gospel that we're looking at for today. And I'll be honest, it's a passage that's an uncomfortable passage for me. There's some neat things in it, but there's some things that bother me in it as well. And one of the things that bothers me is that you have God, through an angel, appearing to Joseph repeatedly in a dream, when most of the time God doesn't appear to us or talk to us that profoundly. It's usually a simple whisper, a quiet whisper, sometimes through another person, sometimes through a family member, sometimes through a friend, but it's usually not a significant inbreaking. And so part of the struggle and frustration is I've been around friends where God has given them clear visions. I've had moments in my life where God has given me visions, but that's not how God usually talks, and sometimes it would make life a lot easier if that's the way God talked to us all the time. But what really disturbs me the most about this passage is here you have Joseph and Mary in Bethlehem with the baby Jesus, and the angel speaks to Joseph in a dream and says, pack up and head to Egypt. Get out of there. You're in danger. And what's happened is Herod learned from the wise men, and you know, I grew up with these nativity scenes where you had the shepherds and the wise men. Even though nowhere in the Bible are they both there together, and what we know now is that the odds are is the wise men would have probably shown up 1 to 2 years later, because if the star had shone over Jesus at his birth, it would have taken them to get from the east there between 1 and 2 years. And so that's why you no longer usually see the nativity with wise men, is because we know they wouldn't have been there, and nowhere in the Bible does it actually put them both there at the same time, which is interesting. But what disturbs me is Herod sees this as a threat, and because he can't find this baby, decides to kill all of them, and orders his troops into Bethlehem and in the outlying area and says, you kill everyone 2 years old and under. And God lets it happen. And the angel only warns Joseph to flee with Mary and Jesus that we know of, and allows Herod to go in and wipe out all of the children 2 years old and younger. That's uncomfortable for me. But I think part of that uncomfortableness, and there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that's uncomfortable, is because somehow God wants to give us the freedom to truly love God. And in doing it, God has to allow us the room and space where we do bad things to each other. And give that space and let that space be there. So it makes it uncomfortable when you read that part of the story. What's cool in this passage to me is that God, through that angel, speaks to Joseph, and he immediately responds with obedience. And he gets up and he goes to Egypt. And then when the angel speaks to him and says it's okay to go back home, he packs up the family and heads back home. And we don't know how many years transpired, but it was a little bit of time. And when he gets back home, he realizes that it's still unsafe in parts of Israel, in the part where he was originally heading. And so the angel gives him permission to go to Galilee, which is a little farther out of the center of Israel, where he goes to Nazareth and raises his family in Nazareth. And so what I like is how he responds to God's prompting with obedience. What I also like about it is not just that he responds to God's prompting with that obedience, but it shows that even in being obedient to God, he's afraid. And that God's okay and lets him be afraid in these journeys. And sometimes we forget that. That here is someone who earlier on discovered, in that two-part marriage process where he was legally married to Mary, but hadn't consummated that marriage through having sex with her, discovers she's with child and is ready to quietly dismiss her, and an angel speaks to her and says, please don't. And he chooses not to and stays faithful to God. That we see him go through these struggles. We see him having to deal with adverse situations. And even in his willingness to be obedient to God, God lets him be afraid. And that he still stays obedient even when he is afraid. But God doesn't necessarily make the fear go away, but allows it to be there. And you see the humanness, the real humanness in Joseph. And sometimes that struggle with being faithful to God, sometimes there's fear involved in being faithful to God, because God sometimes pushes us and moves us into uncomfortable places and calls us to do things that aren't necessarily comfortable. Sometimes God calls us to reach out and connect with people in ways that we don't always think about. And usually those nudges are whispers, quiet little whispers. And what I want to do today is share with you 3 of those whispers that became really cool stories this year, that happened this year, that I think are God whispering to people and them responding to that, whether they realize it or not, and how it affected people in some cool ways. The first is about a boy named Dylan who lives in Texas, who's 11 years old. And he was sitting with his family watching the news when tornadoes rolled through Oklahoma and wiped out whole communities. And he saw the pictures of houses destroyed, houses that looked like his houses just completely devastated by the tornado, people without power, people having to pick their lives up and put them back together, and him as an 11-year-old boy struggling with, I want to help, how do I help? And trying to figure out what can I do, because I can't go to Oklahoma, he's 11, I can't go to Oklahoma City and rebuild a house for them. You know? So he started thinking about it, and what he would do in the summer to raise money is he would mow lawns. And he suddenly came up with the idea that he could mow lawns and take all the money he earned from mowing lawns and send it to Oklahoma to help out the tornado victims. And so he talked with his parents, and they found an organization that they knew was legitimately getting money to the people in need. And so he made the goal that he was going to try and raise $2,000. So he started mowing lawns, and 87 lawns in, he had $2,000, and he was only partway through the summer. And he said, well, you know what, I can do more. And so he started mowing more and got up to $3,000. When people started finding out what he was doing and why he was mowing, they started giving him money. And in a matter of one summer, he went from $2,000 to the end of the summer, he raised $16,000 just mowing lawns. And people seeing what he was doing and why, an 11-year-old kid. And he took that $16,000 and got it to an organization that was directly helping the people who had lost their homes and everything due to the tornado. And they were able, his family was able to then take him to where his money was making a difference. And he actually got to help out families there by mowing their lawns because they no longer had a lawnmower. And he got to actually do things for the people who the money he raised was helping out. That's God whispering. And a little boy hearing the whisper and responding. And touching a bunch of people's lives, not just the ones in Oklahoma City, but he also touched the lives of his family and all the people who he was mowing their lawns for. That's God whispering. A second story that happened this year was a bus driver had a bus full of high schoolers. They were on a field trip. And I don't know whether, and this was in Buffalo, New York, and I don't know whether they were driving to wherever they were going or driving from it, but they're going slowly along the road, and they're coming to a bridge over an overpass, and the bus driver sees a woman on the wrong side of the railing, on the outside of the bridge over the overpass, holding on, looking like she was about to jump. And someone in the back saw it too and started recording it with their phone. And the bus driver slows down, watches a person walk by her and ignore her, watches someone on a bike ride by and ignore her. So he pulls up the bus next to her, opens the door, stops the bus, and asks, are you okay? Do you need help? You're on the wrong side of the bridge. And she doesn't respond. So he stops the bus. He gets out, walks up to her, and he hugs her. And then he takes her arm, holds onto it, helps her turn around, get over the rail, And he sits down on the sidewalk with her and just starts talking to her. And some of the kids on the bus realize that this is an emergency situation, and they call 911, and he simply sits with her and talks with her until the police and the ambulance come, and they're able to check her out, and they were able to take her away and get her the help she needed. And when he walked back on that bus, the whole thing erupted in cheers, because they just watched him save a woman's life. And for him, he just saw someone in need, and whether he realized it or not, heard God whispering. And he stopped the bus, stopped the field trip, and helped. And all the kids in the bus thought he was a hero, because he saved that woman's life that day. That to me is how God whispers to us. That to me is God was whispering to Joseph, God whispers to us. And we hopefully respond with obedience. And one more story that happened this year happened down in Miami-Dade County. A woman was in a grocery store, and she was shoplifting some food, and she got caught. And a woman police officer arrived on the scene with her partner and went in and explained to the woman what was going to happen to her, how this was going to affect her, and all of this, and was talking. And as she was talking, she realized that the woman was doing what she was doing because she had no resources. She was a single mom with a couple of kids, had no family, was not making it, had no job, and her kids had no food. And she was stealing because she was desperate, because she had to find a way to feed her kids, and had no idea where the resources were. She was new and was struggling. And this police officer woman had been a single mom and had almost not made it herself. Luckily, she had family around who carried her through to the point that allowed her to get on her feet to where she was able to become an officer. And so she took the woman, went back into the grocery store, walked through and bought her $100 worth of groceries so that she could take care of herself and her kids for a week, and helped her get them home. And later in the week, the woman came with her kids to the police station to meet this officer that did that for her, and to thank her. And she only told her sergeant, her partner, do it. There were only a couple people knew it, but somehow someone found out about the story. It got leaked to the media, and the media hunted down the woman and talked to the woman and put the story of what this officer did for her on the news. And in response to that, people came to her and were able to start connecting her with the services that were available, got her into her own place with her kids, and companies came to her and said, we'd like to interview you for a job, and she has now been able to get a job that pays enough to allow her to take care of her kids. All because this one police officer turned around and said, let me give you $100 worth of groceries so that you can feed your kids, instead of hauling you off to jail. God whispering, and God using people, us, you and me. The bus driver was just a bus driver. You don't usually think of a glamorous person being someone who drives kids to and from field trips. 11-year-old kid, not an Albright scholar. He was a kid who mowed lawns and decided instead of mowing lawns to use the money for me, how about I give it to people who lost their homes because he was devastated by the images of torn up houses. Or a police officer who had almost herself gone under trying to be a single mom, who sees another single mom and realizes, maybe I can make a difference, and buys her $100 of groceries. That's God whispering, and us obedient to respond to that whisper. That's our challenge. Our challenge for this week is, how are you listening to that whisper from God? And in what way can you respond obediently? How do we be the children of God that God hopes to see us be? And live out the love God shows to us through giving us his son Jesus, that baby who died for us. Because God